In Southern states before 1965, Black citizens faced many barriers to registering to vote. In the 1960s, organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Dallas County Voters League were in Selma, Alabama to help Black citizens with voter registration. Civil rights groups were urging President Lyndon B. Johnson to sponsor a bill on voting rights, but he had other priorities. In March of 1965, people from Selma and other parts of the country marched from Selma to Montgomery, peacefully protesting against the tragedy of not having equal voting rights. The march from Selma to Montgomery gained national attention, which pressured Johnson to push for passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a triumph in the civil rights movement, dramatically increasing the number of registered Black voters in Southern states. In 1870, the 15th Amendment gave all African American men the right to vote. But even with the right to vote, many restrictions stood in their way of registering to vote. These restrictions were part of laws called Jim Crow laws that segregated the South. There were many ways of preventing Blacks from voting, such as literacy tests, which were purposefully made hard to pass, poll taxes that were too expensive for many Blacks, and grandfather clauses, which said that if their grandfather could vote before 1867, they could vote. But since few Blacks could vote before 1867, it only worked for whites. African Americans attempting to vote would often be threatened or hurt by whites. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in voting registration, but it did not address many of the existing barriers, and it was ignored in the southern states. In the small city of Selma, in Dallas County, Alabama, the majority of the population was Black, but only about 2.1% of them were registered to vote. Amelia Boynton from the Dallas County Voters League, the DCVL, asked civil rights organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, to come to Selma to help Blacks register. Throughout 1964, SNCC tried to help register Black voters in Selma, without much success. On January 18, 1965, SNCC began working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC to make efforts to get people registered to vote. On February 18th, in the nearby town of Marion, Alabama, Jimmy Lee Jackson, with his family and other local families in Marion, participated in a night march. Jackson had been protesting for voting rights ever since he was denied the right to vote 4 years earlier. The marchers were attacked, and trying to protect his mother, Jackson was shot in the stomach and died 8 days later. James Bevel from the SCLC said that everyone had to get ready to march to Montgomery and sleep on the highway. The idea caught on, and a decision was made to march on Sunday, March 7th. SNCC decided not to participate as a group because of disagreements with SCLC. John Lewis, chairman of SNCC at the time, wanted to do the march because he thought the people of Selma were hurting, angry, and needed to take action. Lewis decided that he'd march as John Lewis, not a member of SNCC. The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, said that he'd make sure that the marchers wouldn't make it to Montgomery. On Sunday, March 7th, 600 people gathered at Brown Chapel, ready to march. It was led by Hosea Williams and John Lewis. When the marchers reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they saw a sea of Alabama state troopers sent by Governor Wallace. The state troopers told them they'd have 2 minutes to disperse, but didn't give them 2 minutes. They started attacking the marchers with nightsticks, clubs, and tear gas. Many were injured and beaten. Across the nation, that day became known as Bloody Sunday. Later that day, King decided that they'd make another attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery on Tuesday, March 9th. King was told to call off the march by Judge Frank Johnson in Montgomery, but King decided that he'd lead the march to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. On March 9th, many people from across the country came to Selma after seeing what happened during Bloody Sunday on TV. Dr. King called people of goodwill to come to Selma and complete the march. King led a group of over 1,500 marchers to the bridge, yet again the highway was blocked by more state troopers. King asked the state troopers for a moment to pray and was given permission to. After praying, he turned the group around, and it became known as Turnaround Tuesday. It caused confusion across many marchers, and many were upset with King for turning around. On March 15th, President Lyndon B. Johnson gave a speech to Congress on live television. He spoke of how all citizens must have the right to vote, no matter the color of their skin. He proposed to make a bill that banished restrictions from the right to vote.
Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
A few days later, Judge Johnson ruled the marchers could march to Montgomery.
I received 35 stitches. I was determined that I was going to go from Selma to Montgomery so I could let the then Governor, George Wallace, see my bandaged head, see what he had done to me.
The third attempt of the march took place on March 21st. Over 3,000 people gathered at Brown Chapel, prepared to march. President Johnson sent National Guardsmen to protect the marchers on the highway. It was a 54-mile march split into 5 days. After about 5-6 miles of walking, only 300 people were permitted to continue marching on the highway, and the rest took buses back to Selma.
Lyndon Johnson had federalized the Alabama National Guard to protect us along the way, and they said that they could only protect 300 people.
On the 5th day, they made it to Montgomery. The last few miles of the march, people from across the country joined in, turning the group from 300 people to 25,000.
It was an awesome feeling. I had started something, and I was on my way to finishing or completing it.
The Selma to Montgomery march, and especially the television coverage, pressured President Johnson to take action and push for a voting rights bill to be passed by Congress. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. The act banned restrictions in voting places in all elections, and if there were any restrictions, voters could challenge them. The act outlawed many restrictions on registration, such as literacy tests. Soon after the act was signed into law, around 9,000 black voters registered in Dallas County, and the number of registered black voters throughout southern states rose. Today there are fewer barriers for voting, and the voting turnout of black people has increased largely since 1965. And as the number of African American voters has grown, so has the number of black people running for office. In 2008, when Barack Obama ran for the United States president, the black voter turnout percentage was higher than the white voter turnout percentage. But in 2013, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was declared unconstitutional in the court case Shelby County v. Holder. Section 4 was about having provisions with certain states, such as Alabama, that had discrimination with voting. Since Shelby County v. Holder, 33 states have enacted voter ID laws to keep many citizens from voting. Although there are increased barriers to voting today, because of the Selma to Montgomery March and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, more people can vote than ever before.